Well, my name is Andrew Lownie. I'm a literary agent, but I'm also a historian and have become a freedom of information campaigner. I've written a number of books which I hope revise history, and one of my great sort of themes is the fact that our history is censored, that so much of it is not released, is destroyed, that the whole story of our historical past is curated, often by rich and powerful people. And I think it's very important, in order to tell the truth about the past, that we have full access to all our records. We have a Public Records Act, which now requires public authorities to lodge their files within 20 years. And yet this isn't happening. And we also have a Freedom of Information Act, which is meant to open up and make more transparent government. And yet there are so many exemptions that are applied in a very draconian way that it's become even more difficult to find out about what's happened than even before the Act itself.
Can you give us an example of your most high-profile case, either past or present, and the difficulties that you faced and the outcomes?
I think probably the most high-profile case I've been involved in is when I was researching my biography of Dickie and Edwina Mountbatten. I requested access to their personal diaries and letters, which had been bought by the University of Southampton with public funds to be seen by the public. That was part of the fundraising. It was bought under the Acceptance and Lieu scheme. And to be told that these documents, which had been quoted by other historians, were not available, that they were closed by this mysterious ministerial direction, Section 44 of the Freedom of Information Act, and I couldn't see them. Now, I challenged this, and eventually the Information Commissioner ruled in November 2019 that this material should be made available to me and everyone else. The government, because they felt they had this hold because of Section 44, and Southampton University, who bought the material, appealed that decision. They brought in very expensive, high-profile lawyers, and I was forced to defend this appeal because the Information Commissioner really didn't do much. And that's cost me close to £500,000. I've secured the release of over 33,000 pages of material, a very important historical document, but it came at a huge personal and financial cost. And this is entirely wrong. This material was bought to be seen by the public. It was closed quite illegally. And I cannot understand why Southampton then challenged the decision, spent, again, probably millions of pounds on suppressing this information. They are meant to be a university supporting academic freedom and open access to archives. So that's probably my most famous case, but it's been a whole series of cases where I've sought access to historical documents which should be available to help me with my research and found that they were closed. And so I had a series of battles which have taken me through the Information Commissioner through to tribunals. There is one coming up shortly on the use of Section 23 and 24 in the alternative. These are the national security exemptions, one of which is a public interest test. And it's never clear when the public interest test might be used. I have another case where I wanted access to the Duke of Windsor's protection file from 1932, which the Metropolitan Police said would affect the safety of the royal family. The Information Commissioner agreed. I took it to a tribunal and we're now awaiting that decision. But there is no evidence that a file from 1932 would place the royal family's safety in jeopardy. There are far more recent events happening, including disclosures made in Prince Harry's own book, Spare, television programmes, and indeed the memoirs of police protection officers, which are more likely to do that than a document which is now almost 100 years old.
What do you think it is that allows there to be such inconsistency in outcomes when it comes to access to information?
Well, I think one of the problems is access to historical documents is controlled by the public authorities. It's up to those authorities to lodge them in the National Archives. And so the government has control of what we see. Many documents are destroyed with no record being kept. And so it's very difficult to judge what's exactly happening. MI5 have a program of releasing documents, but they don't do it in a systematic way. There's a little bit here, a little bit there. It's not chronological. And therefore you can't get the full picture if you're looking at, for example, a particular case, as I did with my biography on Guy Burgess. Some material came out in 2015. Some material is still being released to this day. And much of it remains closed. And that's wrong. It would be much better if everything that could be released was released in an ordered fashion, so historians had the full picture to write their books. Is there inconsistency? Yes, there's inconsistency in the way that redactions are applied. Sometimes a name is redacted and the same name will appear further down the page. Sometimes a particular role is redacted when the same role is left open. We see things redacted in government documents which are in other government documents, either similar files or the London Gazette or even websites. So it makes a mockery of the whole system that some stuff is kept secret and others isn't, with no real logic to it. So there needs to be root and branch reform. The exemptions shouldn't be applied, as they say, in such a draconian form, and the files should be released in the proper timescale, which is now 20 years.
Would you say there is or isn't joined up thinking in relation to what gets redacted and what gets released? What do you think is the cause of the problem, if there is one?
I think the reason that there's no joined up thinking on this is that the people who look at the records and make the redactions, known as readers, are generally government officials, retired. And some are more cautious than others, some are more informed. And so there is no... they have their rules to apply, but my understanding is that they apply them in a very heavy-handed way, that if they're in doubt, they will redact, they will use exemptions without a public interest test, such as national security or law enforcement. And as a result, history suffers. A lot of stuff is closed that shouldn't be closed. And so I think there needs to be a change of culture in Whitehall and in the management record departments to ensure that more stuff is released. I think it's important that, of course, secrets are kept, are maintained, confidentialities are kept, but it's very hard to trust the system when one feels that those in charge of it are abusing it and are taking a very tough line. Keep the secrets which are secret, and let everything out. That is the line of the states, and that should be the line here.
What do you think could solve this? Who should be appealed to, and how can more people be brought on board to recognise the significance of this upon our daily life?
Well, change can only really come through parliamentary pressure. So it's a job for the MPs to lobby government ministers, to have maybe a parliamentary commission, for some of the parliamentary committees to look at the operation of the Freedom of Information Act and the Information Commissioner's Office, and to hold the government account when they are not doing things. So letters from constituents to MPs should be followed up. There should be parliamentary debates. There should be parliamentary questions. There's a role also here for the media to raise and highlight these issues, and also for the lawyers to be much tougher. I think one of my concerns is many of the judges seem to be nobbled and are not acting independently. They're very much siding on the status quo and supporting stuff which is frankly ludicrous, like this protection file from 100 years ago. There is a Freedom of Information organisation. It's done sterling work for many years on a shoestring, but they need more resources. They need more money. They need more staff. And they will then be able to highlight these issues. There are a whole plethora of organisations that deal with transparency in government, open democracy, English Pen, and others. And they all need to work together, Index on Censorship, to highlight these issues and to shine a light on these problems. And one will hope that public authorities, perhaps in the light of this pressure, will begin to take a more enlightened view of records. I'm afraid things are getting worse since the Freedom of Information Act over 20 years ago. It was the one regret of Tony Blair. The result is we get more sober government and less actually being recorded. We're seeing stuff on WhatsApp and just basically post-it notes being stuck on files and then taken off. There was a brief moment with an initiative taken by Lord Waldegrave in the 1990s. MI5 and MI6 went public and were avowed. We saw the proper release program for MI5 files, for example. And that was our moment of glasnost. And then, since then, governments have basically pushed back on that. and have got much more adept at not being open with freedom of information requests, rebutting them. They've starved the organisations like the Information Commissioner of the resources to properly enforce their role as regulator. And so we are in a very depressing position of trying to hold back and safeguard the position we've been in against these onslaughts from government which doesn't like scrutiny. I would say that the government is under less scrutiny than it's ever been, that the press don't really feel that that's their job now, it seems, don't have the resources to do it, it doesn't get the clickbait they want. And we live with a dark state. I never really believed this before, but I think there is a hidden part to government which is not operating in the interests of the people they are meant to represent. I'm determined to get my costs back on the Mountbatten diary scandal. I should not have to spend £500,000 ensuring something that was bought with public funds to be seen by scholars was seen, and particularly when 99% of the material, over 30,000 pages, were released shortly before the hearing. And given the unreasonable behaviour of Southampton University in my dealings with them and my lawyers' dealings with them, to the extent that there were instituted contempt of court proceedings by the Information Commissioner. That was the first time that had ever happened. So once I've got my costs, I will be continuing to campaign for the release of the Edwina Nehru correspondence, bought at the same time with public monies to be seen, and which could be released on the payment of £100 by Southampton. And I will continue my fight to have more files released, particularly the files on the royal family. There are files going back over a century which seem completely innocent and which should be available so that people can write proper, serious books about them and not rely on leaks from members of the royal household. And so there's a lot of work still to be done to ensure that the history of the past is told properly and that vacuum is not filled by fantasists and speculation.
How can people watching this video get involved and learn more about the campaign to get better information, and also, in particular, for you to get your money back?
Well, I think the two things that people can do to help. One is I still have a crowdfunding site under Crowd Justice in my name. I still, I think, owe about £40,000 to the lawyers who sadly wouldn't operate on a pro bono basis. And there is an organisation, the Campaign for Freedom of Information, which needs more money. It needs more to pay more staff and to run more campaigns. And so there's two, I would say, worthy ways of responding to this plea. They do sterling work and deserve to have support. People seem much more prepared to give money to donkey sanctuaries, or if they're going to meet the members of the royal family, than something which I think goes to the core of living in democracy, which is fighting against the abuse of state power and which is championing freedom of speech.
If people want to stay informed in relation to fighting against the abuse of state power, particularly with regard to information, can you tell me good places to look for information, and also how to filter information any way you see it?
I think there are a number of sites that will give you information. The Index and Censorship is an organisation which produces a magazine, has a very good website. English Pen is another. There is clearly the Campaign for Freedom of Information. There's something called Open Democracy. So there are a whole series of places that we can go to, including the Information Commissioner's website, which announces the decision notices. And of course, they all have social media, and looking at social media will lead you on to other similar organizations. Clearly, there are some journalists who specialize in this area. Particularly the Times' investigations unit, the Guardian and the Mail. And so there is information out there, but one just feels that one is sort of knocking at a door which the government are keeping firmly closed.
Who would you regard as a fellow campaigner for better access to better information?
Well, I mean, Private Eye have been a terrific support to me in my campaign and other campaigns. I mean, they are prepared to speak truth to power. I have terrific admiration for journalists such as Peter Oborne and Owen Bocott and others who have written extensively about some of these issues. And I think one of the problems is journalists feel that their careers may be in trouble if they challenge the orthodoxy and authority. But, we need people like them who will shine a light on corruption and, frankly, incompetence, which are basically covered up by the fact that we can't see this information. I think one of the things that can be done is to focus on the censoring of royal records. There's more work that could be done at the Royal Archives in Windsor to have a public inventory. They're refusing, for example, to release the financial records of Edward VIII, the future Duke of Windsor, even though those records are 100 years old. There are over 500 files in the National Archives which are closed relating to the royal family, all of which, to me, look completely innocuous and go back a long time. It would be a very simple matter to release that material, and that would mean we could actually write our royal history properly and accurately, rather than rely on tittle-tattle from palace servants and from newspaper accounts which may not be accurate.
What documents do you think ought to be routinely released that are not routinely released, that then turn into an unnecessary fight, which could be solved by routinely releasing them?
Well, the government departments, public authorities are required to release all their files unless they're subject to FOI exemptions within 20 years. So we should now be looking at files from the year 2000, and that's not the case. Clearly, some files will be duplicates, some will be administrative, but many files are destroyed without us knowing what they are. And so we have no idea how important they are. For example, I know that special branch files on Wallace Simpson from the 1930s were destroyed in the early part of this century. Now, those are important historical documents which, should not be destroyed by special branch officers, but by, if they are going to be destroyed, by historians, looked at by historians, and indeed they should have been preserved. So only a small proportion of files are being released, with the vast number of files in Whitehall. It's a big job, but we need to devote the resources to having a proper record management system so that our history is being properly recorded and is being made available to the public to write the history of the past properly.
Have you ever tried to access information from your local authority here in Westminster or your neighbour in Kensington? And what has that been like? Because in the same way that you've got national archives, what is it like at a local level? Because obviously people live in their own areas.
I haven't sought records from my local authority, but my wife, who writes histories of people's houses in London, has. And actually, I found them very helpful. I mean, the records are there. They even have, for example, collections of estate agency particulars. The rate books go back to the 18th century. So our local records, with a few exceptions where, for example, there's been bombing damage, are very good. So if we can maintain these local records, why can't we maintain proper national records?
With a couple of stories, you've got Boris borrowing money and the credit facility. So basically, I read that, did I send it to you? I read that it was Sam Blythe.
Yeah.
His great-grandfather is Boris Johnson's great-great-great-grandfather.
Right.
That's the connection.
Right.
So a mind like mine, thinking about the way you think about things, I think, right, okay, smoking guns, documents. What's his name? Sharp went to Case and said, we need to make sure the rules are followed. This is all he said he's done, and Case then said, because this loan or the guarantor is family, we don't have to. Right. And Lord Geit retrospectively said family and foreign, so we approve the facility and we say we don't have to declare it. But the thing is, that's the grandson of his second cousin. If this is the royal family, this would be people who've never met, who have no connection. So, I mean, I could ask you, how have you come across Simon Case? and how have you come across Heppenstall, but in ways which are just factual.
Yeah, okay, fine.
You know, so this is just going to be called Simon Case. Simon Case. Have you ever interacted with the Cabinet Secretary Simon Case?
I've not personally interacted with Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, but Dr. David Owen, the former Foreign Secretary, wrote to Case on my behalf, saying it was ridiculous that I had been penalised financially seeking access to documents which should have been open. Now, Case didn't reply to that. He passed it to a man called Darren Turney, who is the head of ethics in the Cabinet Office. But it's very clear that the campaign, which I think has been mounted against me, there's a monitoring campaign following me with my talks and articles, is all emanating from the Cabinet Office, for which Simon Case is responsible. And I believe that there needs to be more scrutiny of the activities of the Cabinet Office and indeed of the Cabinet Secretary, because I do not feel that we are getting the full story of what is happening in that building.
When did Lord Owen contact Simon Case? And Simon Case, he, before Cabinet Secretary, was working for Prince William, wasn't he? So I'm not sure of the timeline. Could you just go over a little bit of the timeline?
Simon Case clearly has a background having worked for the Prince of Wales, and so he's clearly very well connected in the axis between Buckingham Palace and Whitehall. And that's fine. I think that's important that people at the centre of power should know, in a sense, the various bits of the establishment. But I do feel that there should be more openness about what goes on, how decisions are made. I would like to know who are these people who are, for example, initiated the appeal against the ICO decision. I think there's an awful lot seems to go on the Cabinet Office without any proper ministerial or parliamentary scrutiny. And this is not good in a democracy.
Richard Sharp, the BBC chairman, he was appointed by Boris Johnson, and then it was being looked into by William Shawcross. Could you tell me, have you come across either William Shawcross or the person he chose to replace him, Adam Heppenstall, and can you say anything factual about these people?
I think the whole story of Richard Sharp's appointment to the BBC has not been entirely open. I think there must be some concerns about the appointment. Adam Heppenstall, who is a very able lawyer who has been, in a sense, acted against me on behalf of the government in various cases, has been asked to investigate. I just hope that there is a proper, fair and impartial investigation into these matters, and this isn't an establishment cover-up.
Have you ever come across William Shawcross? Because I know he did the biography of Murdoch in '93.
I've personally not come across William Shawcross. I mean, he was asked to write the official life of the Queen Mother with no real background as a royal biographer. He has held clearly a number of establishment quangos. And, you know, he was one of the great and the good, and a close friend of the King. But again, one has to wonder about some of these appointments and how far the appointment process is open and fair.
Can you say anything about... So, Boris Johnson has borrowed money, but we don't really know very much about the story. And so there may be documentation at the Cabinet Office and banking and things like that. But you look at old stories, things from the past. So can you tell me a little bit about Churchill borrowing money in terms of, the one person I've heard of that he borrowed money off and who else they lent to and how you have covered some of these people's lives?
Well, there's a lot of scrutiny at the moment on Boris Johnson, who's been borrowing money, which seems odd because he's been making huge amounts of money from his public speaking. And he's also managed to get legal aid to deal with the Partygate affair. So it all seems rather odd. But I mean, Churchill himself, a greatly respected figure, had his own financial problems. David Locke has written a very good book called No More Champagne, dealing with this. And Churchill was borrowing money, often not repaid, from people like Ernest Cassels and others. He had help with the purchase of Chartwell, even though he could afford to buy the house himself. And It's only really until David Locke's book a few years ago that people, I think, were aware of the very dodgy finances of our greatest Prime Minister. Finances which have made him liable to blackmail, and I have to say don't reflect very well on his financial, on his probity.
Can you talk about Castles, that he was Edwina Mountbatten's grandfather, and that he was also a banker to other people, and possible parallels with today?
Ernest Cassels is a fascinating figure. I came across him when I was writing my book on the Mountbattens because he was Edwina's grandfather. He, in fact, was the person who brought her up really after her mother died when she was a child. She acted as his housekeeper. She was named after Edward VII, who was her godfather, who basically borrowed money from Cassels, much of it not returned. So there was a very close relationship there. And of course Edwina had very close relationship with Winston Churchill as well through Castle. So it's very interesting to see these interlocking relationships because of course Churchill was also close to Dickie Mountbatten's father, who was at one point First Sea Lord during the First World War. So you could really get a sense that, particularly shown in Anthony Sampson's book Anatomy of Britain, on the close working networks that existed then, and I have to say exist to this day.
What you just said, how do you know the things that you just said? Are these all publicly released documents, and when and where were they released, or were they just everybody knew because the papers talked about them? How is it known, the types of things that you just said about the relationships, particularly between Mountbatten, Castles, the King?
I mean, we know about these interlocking relationships through biographies, from papers that have been released, from articles at the time, their own memoirs. I mean, there's no secret about these interlocking relationships. Those ones, of course, that we know about. I mean, there may be other organisations, I can think of the Freemasons, where things are going on quietly behind the scenes that we're not aware of. And of course, it's very difficult when you're looking at things that have happened to always see the causal link, because unless we have the information, and this comes back to my argument about censoring records, we don't always know how things have worked.
Can you say anything about the Society of Biographers? I hope I've got the name right, because I read on your website that you founded it and that you provide support to people who are serious about researching and writing biography.
I set up the Biographers Club 25 years ago, and the purpose was for biographers to network, meet each other, to share information, for example, about archives or subjects, publishers, film deals, things that where they could work together to help each other, but also push forward the cause of biography, perhaps even to campaign for biographers. I'd hoped that they might, for example, have taken a rather more prominent stand in my fight to get access to the Mountbatten diaries and letters. And they meet for social events to hear speakers. There's a much larger organisation. I'm president of the Biographers Club, but I'm also on the advisory council of something called Biographers International organisation, which is based in the States, which is much more active. It has every May, over 3 days, a big conference with speakers. It gives prizes. And has much closer links with the academic community, particularly with biographical centres such as the Leon Levy Centre in New York. It's a much better financed, and I have to say a much more impressive organisation than the Biographers Club, which is a rather sleepy British operation. But I think there is scope for the two of them to work more together. And I hope for the Biographers Club to grow and to become more of a campaigning force for the release of records. I think one of the most shocking things I found researching my Mountbatten book was an interview with a woman called Lady Desise by the FBI during the war, in which she revealed that Mountbatten, who she knew, was a man with an interest in young boys, perversion. I think she called him a perverted. And this document, I think, had never been seen by anyone. It's certainly never been published. And it confirmed what I was hearing from other sources about Mountbatten's paedophilia. I requested other files, because there were other file numbers listed, relating to Mountbatten and his wife. And I was told after I requested them that those files had been closed. In fact, they'd been destroyed. And when I asked when they were destroyed, I was told very honestly by the American authorities, after you requested them. So they've been kept from 1940 through to 2016-17, and they've been closed and destroyed at the request of the British government, who wanted to cover up the story. Here was a rich and powerful figure, the uncle of Prince Philip, who was committing criminal acts, and yet this was being covered up by the government.
Can you tell me, how did you approach the Kincora story? And I read about it in the paper that, for example, that Mountbatten had a thing for young Sri Lankan boys. How did you find out about that, and how did you go about putting that in the book with any kind of evidence or anything like that?
There have been lots of rumours about Mountbatten's abuse of boys who'd been at a boys' home in Belfast called Kincora. And I managed to find one of the boys who was there, to interview him, and for him to describe his experience with Mountbatten at Mountbatten's holiday home on the west coast of Ireland, Classiebawn. But I've tried over the last 5 or 6 years to get access to the Kincora files. They have been now released to the National Archives, heavily weeded. Basically, there's nothing there of any import at all. It was a real fight to get them released. They claimed that they were going to be released, but it took several years for that to actually happen. I had to really put pressure on the Northern Ireland office. And I think one of the shocking things is that we know that the car logs of people visiting Mountbatten at Classiebawn in August 1977, when this boy from Kincora and a Sri Lankan boy who was trafficked from London were abused by Mountbatten, that those car logs, which the Garda, the Irish police, admit they have, will not be released on the grounds that they relate to Mountbatten's murder, which took 2 years later. Now, this is just an excuse to cover up material, and I think to cover up the fact that they know who the person was who came to Classiebawn in August 77 with these boys. And we think it's a man called William McGrath who ran the Kincora Boys' Home. I'm very grateful to those of you who have contributed to the crowdfunding campaign. I've raised £75,000 from over 100 contributors. But also, I'm grateful to those who've read my books on the Mountbattens and Edward VIII, and who I think support what I'm trying to do, which is to try and write as honestly and in as balanced and fair a way as I can about powerful figures in the past whose stories have not always been told as honestly as they should have been. My next book is on Prince Andrew. I'll be looking very much at his role as a trade envoy. And I hope that people will find that there are some interesting new disclosures in that book, which will be published in 2024. Once this book on Prince Andrew is finished, I'll be looking for subjects. I'm always open to ideas, but at the moment I'm tempted to add my name to the list of potential biographers for Boris Johnson, because I think there's still much more that could be said about him. He's clearly still a potent force in British politics, but I have to say someone who